Upstate Medical University in Syracuse, New York invites you to be the informed patient with the podcast that features experts from Central New York's only academic medical center. I'm your host, Amber Smith. You may have heard of a doula who provides guidance and support to a pregnant woman during labor. There are also end-of-life or death doulas. I'll be speaking with one today. Jim Brulé also volunteers as a chaplain at Upstate. Welcome to the Informed Patient, Mr. Brulé.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Can you start by telling us what a death doula is?
Well, yes, absolutely. As you implied, a death doula is the corresponding role to a birth doula. We are people who put the person who's at end of life at the center of our attention. And we do what we can to make that a better transition. Now, that sounds vague because it is. There's lots of different kinds of work that death doulas do, from cleaning the house to sitting vigil to doing grief work to helping with advocacy. I mean, it really is a broad spectrum of services. And death doulas basically take on those things that they feel especially drawn to and especially qualified to do.
But let me ask, some of end-of-life care is medical. The
Right.
death doula is not involved in the medical part.
We are definitely not medical. We're not clinical folks. And we don't have any official license to do this work, which is something that comes up often. There's no formal certification for this. There's no insurance reimbursement. It's more of a vocation than a profession.
Do death doulas have a particular religious background?
Not by design. So some individuals may have their own. The understanding amongst death doulas is that we are, blind to faith. Unless someone says, gee, I would really like a death doula who knows a lot about Jewish traditions. And then that becomes part of the contract with those folks.
Now, do the doulas work with the individual and the family together? And I'm also wondering about single people. Do death doulas ever work one-on-one with one individual person?
So the answer is yes. We do all of that. When there's a family, or they don't have to be biological family, but when there are caregivers engaged, we will work with them. We're kind of their adjuncts in many ways, although our client is always the person at end of life. Often my work, for example, will extend after the person dies, and I work with the survivors in grief work and other kinds of things. It does spread out because we don't like to see it when somebody is entirely isolated. So we do try and reach out and build their community around them if we can.
Now, is this part of the spiritual care that's offered at hospitals?
Not generally, certainly not at Upstate. And death doulas are generally seen as adjuncts to whether it's hospital care or hospice care or anything like that. We're never the center of things, and we're not something that, certainly not at Upstate, we're not offered as a service. That would be provided by palliative care, by spiritual care. There's plenty of vehicles for that to take place in the hospital as it is.
I see. Well, let's talk a little more about the role of the doula. Are they present around the clock or just particular times?
Well, let me answer the question behind that, which is, how do people and families engage with death doulas? And again, as I mentioned, there's this wide spectrum. So it might be that the family says, we need somebody to come in here and sit vigil for a couple of days. We need somebody to come in and give us some respite for a couple of hours so that we can go away. So in that sense, that might happen. But in general, we're members of the care team in a sense, but we wouldn't sit vigil unless someone could really manage to arrange for that with both the death doula and the family.
How close are people to death when they summon a death doula?
Well, there's this wonderful line I learned in another profession, which is the best time to have done that is 7 years ago, and the second best time is now. So, often people will wait until they have a terminal diagnosis. And that's probably the most frequent time we get our first call. And then as they start to decline, that might be a second call. However, I have clients who have no imminent disease, no imminent diagnosis, and I'm working with them to help deal with their own mortality because I know it's coming. What do you know? It's coming to us all. So I do work with a number of people who aren't close to death, or they've had a terminal diagnosis and then they've gotten past it and they say, oh boy, I learned a lot. I'd like to work with someone so the next time I go through this better.
This is Upstate's The Informed Patient podcast. I'm your host, Amber Smith. I'm talking with Upstate chaplain and death doula, Jim Brulé. I imagine doulas must have some counseling background in order, because it sounds like a lot of what you provide is emotional support.
Yeah.
But you did say there's no license or registration, but just practically speaking, do most death doulas have a counseling background?
I would say actually no. A large fraction do, but most people get into being a death doula because they've had some kind of significant loss in their own lives, and they see this as a way of giving back. So the training that they will receive will again be focused on the kinds of services that they want to provide. There are, unfortunately, now way too many doula training programs. And some of them are really, really good. And some of them are just capitalizing on the fact that there's a market out there. But in general, you'll learn a lot about the dying process. You'll learn a lot about the regulatory environment in whichever community you live in. You'll learn about ethics. You'll learn a lot about how do you manage the group interactions that have to take place. There's a lot to learn. And there's so much, in fact, that people will start to specialize in what they want to offer.
Can you give us some examples of the resources or referrals that a death doula might make?
Sure. So certainly one set of referrals would have to do around the whole question of hospice, because a lot of times we'll get engaged in hospice is either not involved or they're wondering about hospice. Another set of referrals will be around simply caregiving. Do they need a house cleaner to come in? Do they need those kinds of services that would be useful? We'll have a lot to do with helping them understand things like advance directives. And here in New York State, we won't give legal advice, but we will certainly direct them to people if they have more complex problems or questions about how to handle that. And we will, of course, be working with whoever are the medical care providers to make sure that we understand what the plan is and make sure the patient has another person they can just talk to and say, is this what this means? Again, we're not clinical. We can serve in that communication role.
Remind me what MOLST is.
Now, it's one of those wonderful acronyms that I've even forgotten. It's an end-of-life declaration that a patient makes with their physician. It has a different status than an advance directive or a living will because it's created with a physician and it has the status of a medical order. So it's kind of the last word in what kinds of treatment someone wants to receive as they get to the end of life.
Now, how would someone go about finding a death doula?
Well, there's a couple of different ways. Certainly, there are two national organizations that have directories, the National End of Life Doula Association and the International End of Life Doula Association, NEDA and INELDA. And so they've got lists of people there who've kind of qualified under their criteria to be listed on their website. Then there are usually local organizations that are caregiving organizations that will include death doulas in their list of service providers. And finally, we each have our own website. There's word of mouth, and we try and stay very connected with the caring community to let people know that we're available. So,
what should a person expect to spend? And I wonder if this would ever be covered by Medicare or health insurance.
well, the answer to the second question is easier. No. This is unfortunately not a reimbursed or regulated service. So there's no reimbursement there. Setting the price is really a challenging thing because often folks at the end of life don't have the financial resources they need to be able to afford this. So most of us have either an hourly rate or a package rate that allows people to say, I can get my foot in the water and see how useful this is. And then we all, speaking for myself, and I know all death doulas, we have ways of making arrangements to see people without a fee if that's needed. So I would say typically for someone who can afford it, I would charge in the neighborhood of 50 an hour. That's something people might expect, but they could also expect it would be a lot less if that was a challenge.
Do you expect that death doulas are going to have a role in helping people understand New York's new Medical Aid in Dying Act that takes effect later this year?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's going to be an important thing for us to help understand. Although, and I'm already engaged in that, one of the challenges is like so many of these state regulations, the guardrails are very, very tight around these. So there won't be many people who can actually take advantage of it. Um, Good, bad, or indifferent, that's the state of affairs. And so, yes, we must understand that. And likely as most people won't be able to take advantage of it.
Now, your particular background is in counseling,
Yes.
psychology, and family therapy. How did you start working with people at the end of life?
Well, again, in a sense, I had some encounters with death and loss early in my life, and that kind of tuned me into that this is something important. It was about almost 20 years ago that I lost my mother, and so that was another kind of push in that direction. So I'd always been working with folks who were in challenging situation. My specialty was adolescence and substance abuse, so there plenty of opportunities for challenges there, which often took me into hospital settings. So I think it's just been part of what I've been doing for a long time.
Is it psychologically challenging to work so close to death?
Well, yes and no. You you shouldn't do it if it doesn't give you a personal reward. And I think most of us don't do that. Most of us are there because there is a reward for us personally and spiritually and psychologically. It is work, so it is draining. But I will tell you, I also volunteer at Francis House, volunteer at hospice. Um, it's a real privilege to be able to work with people who are in that part of their lives. The rewards are really far reaching. So yes, it does get taxing at times, but the rewards far exceed the cost.
What have you learned from people who are dying?
Well, one of the things I've learned is that they are ready to talk to you about things that nobody else will want to talk about. I can walk in the room with someone and say, how's your soul today? How's your spirit today? And that doesn't mean, are you lighthearted? It means what's resting on your heart? What's resting on your soul? And those are wonderful conversations to have. I've learned enough about the end of life process that one of the big challenges is a person will often choose to die when they're either alone, when the concerned family has stepped out of the room, or they'll wait for the right person to arrive. It's really amazing how much how much control people exert over their own passing. And that's given me a lot of insight. It also gives me the opportunity to work with folks and say, maybe it's time to take a walk around the block. Let's see what happens. So it's there's an awful lot to learn. The last thing I'll say is I'm also a grief worker. I do a lot of work with grief, and this has given me just an even more visceral education in what it means to take grief on as a companion, not as a condition to be cured.
Before we wrap up, how would you advise a family to decide whether a death doula could be of help for their situation?
Well, I would say if the question has crossed your mind, it's worth sitting down with one for an hour. We'll generally do that as just part of our normal intake and get to know the person, get to know what they have to offer. And more likely than not, you'll either find a match with them or they'll recommend you to a colleague. Um, or you'll say, gee, I just don't need this right now. Once somebody thinks about it, it's generally a good indication that it's worthwhile.
Well, I appreciate you making time to tell us about death doulas, and this has been very informative, so thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great joy to do this work. It's good to be able to share it with others.
My guest has been Jim Brulé, an upstate chaplain and death doula. The Informed Patient is a podcast covering health, science, and medicine, brought to you by Upstate Medical University in Syracuse, New York, and produced by Jim Howe, with sound engineering by Bill Brokel and graphic design by Dan Cameron. Find our archive of previous episodes at upstate.edu/informed. If you enjoyed this episode, please invite a friend to listen. You can also rate and review the Informed Patient podcast on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you tune in. This is your host, Amber Smith, thanking you for listening.